BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or stable lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, a studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 6 of our Sheroes course, looking at African women as resistance leaders. So we're going to get right into it. We're in session 6, so we only have a few more left. And today we're going to be looking at 2 African queens that led resistance against European colonialism in the 19th century. One in the early part of the 19th century and the other in the later part of the 19th century. We're going to talk a lot about colonialism today. Make sure that you're muted so that we don't get any background feedback. We're going to talk about colonialism today. We're going to move from the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about slavery. We started with colonialism, looking at it a little bit when we talked about Algeria. So we're going to go back to that discussion, talk more about the scramble for Africa period, that period at the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, when the European powers were all trying to get a piece of what they called this magnificent African cake. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about these 2 women and how they led resistance against that. The first person it's a review from last week. Last week we talked about Harriet Tubman, and we talked about resistance against enslavement. Now, Harriet Tubman is just a regular person. I mean, the person that was born in enslavement and was a hero from that angle. Today, we're going to be talking about people that are royalty. And when an empire builders, an empire sustainers, when we look at the life of Harriet Tubman, I can honestly say there's nothing that we know of that someone can look at Harriet Tubman and apply something negative to the things that she did in her life. Of course, none of us are perfect, but there's nothing that you can attach to Harriet Tubman, at least we know from the historical record, that would question her position as a shero. When we talk about queens and royalty and empire builders, the record is mixed. So although today we're going to talk about them in the context of being sheroes, people that defended Africa from colonial invasion and imperialism, in some respects, other parts of the record are a little bit more spotty because they were in the process of empire building, and that is a messy business. We look at empires and royalty and kings and queens, and we look at them with awe, and we love to talk about Black kings and queens, which is great. But always remember, empires are built on exploitation. Somebody's getting exploited. Most people don't voluntarily join empires. You get conquered. And it's easy for us to forget the human element of that we just say, oh, this is a grand empire. But then we don't think, well, what about the people that were incorporated into this empire? Did they want to be? So when we look at these queens, when we look at the history, it's a mixed record. And which is good, because history is not cut and dry. It's not black and white. It has these mixtures in it. And it's always important for us to look for those things. So we talked about enslavement. Now we're going to move back to the continent. And the switch among the European powers from taking African labor outside of the continent to exploit in the Americas and other places to exploiting African labor on the continent, as well as African resources and Africa's strategic position in terms of its place on the rest of the globe. Because the first place we're going to talk about, we're going all the way to the east, all the way to the island of Madagascar. Most maps don't really do Madagascar justice. Madagascar is huge. It's the size of France and Belgium and another country combined. It's a very large place. And it's a part of Africa. Oftentimes we don't think about Malagasy history as African history, but it is. It's a key part of Africa and very strategic. And because of that strategic position, many European powers wanted access to it. And the period that we're going to be talking about is around the 1830s, where 1840s, where a lot of this happens. So the first person that we're going to get into is a queen from this region. So let me get to my clicker is here we go. So you'll notice on this map where we look at Madagascar, there's a little circle that says the Marina Kingdom as one of the great African kingdoms and empires. And not a lot of people know about Marina, but it emerged in the late 1700s. A king emerged there that united many of the peoples in this region, or should I say conquered, because united makes it seem like everybody just agreed to form a kingdom. That's not what happened. People got conquered. One warlord rose up. He used the power of his military as well as the spirituality of the people in the region in Madagascar. Very interesting. They value their ancestors to a very high degree. Everything is built around the power of the ancestors in the traditional religion of this island, or most of the people on the island. So the king represented the ancestors on earth, and the ancestors gave blessings to the living in return for reciprocal offerings to their various representatives. It's like going to church. Some of these prosperity gospels, the more you give to the church, the more blessings you'll get back. But in this case, we're talking about the king. So the commoners would give offerings to their family heads and then to elders in the village, and then that would go all the way up to the king, and then material blessings were supposed to flow back down the other way from the ancestors. So this king was able to set this up. And he's a very long Malagasy name that's escaping me right now, but the last part of it was Marina. So we'll just call him King Marina for right now. I'll get you his long name toward the end of the session, but we'll call him King Marina. King Marina, his next descendant was a young man named Radama the First. And all this history that we're talking about for this section is coming from these sources that we're talking about today. Hard when we start Italian, French, and English colonial records, Black newspapers, and then the oral history in Ethiopia and Malagasy. And we talk about Ethiopian oral history, we're talking about Oromo history, Tigrania history, Shoan history. So there's different subsections of Ethiopia, different nations in Ethiopia. We'll get into that when we talk about Ethiopia. And Malagasy is the name of the culture, the people, and the language of Madagascar. So the first queen we're going to talk about is the third ruler of this Marina dynasty, and this is Ranavaloa the First. Excuse me. Turn this off. Sorry about that. This book, I ran into this book. It's really interesting how I learned about her, because it wasn't necessarily on purpose. For some reason, I was in Pittsburgh, where I'm from, and I think it was in between undergraduate and graduate school. So I'd come home and I just wanted to learn something. So I just went to the University of Pittsburgh's library, went to the Africa section, and said, you know what, I'm just going to, kind of just let the ancestors guide me. Let me just go into the stacks and learn about something I don't know. So I just pulled this book because the title sounded interesting, and it said Female Caligula. And when I went to middle school, I went to a school that prided itself on its classical education. It was called Sterett Classical Academy. So we learned a lot about Greek and Roman history, because that's European classical history. So I learned Latin a little bit, can't speak it anymore. So I knew who Caligula was. Caligula was a mad Roman emperor that committed all types of atrocities. They made movies about this guy. So when I saw this book, it said Female Caligula, Rana Valona, the Mad Queen of Madagascar. I was intrigued. So I sat down and I read the book. And basically in a day, I just sat in the library and I read this book. And I soon realized that it had some good historical information, but the analysis or the interpretation of the history by Laidler was completely Eurocentric. The fact that he would call this queen, based off the activities that she did, the female Caligula, is an incredible misnomer and does an incredible disservice to this defender of Africa. So after reading this book, I started looking at other sources about it, and I came to the conclusion that Laidler, he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish, because I probably wouldn't have read the book without this title, but it really does a disservice to this woman. So let's talk about who she really was, because Laidler paints her out the same way the British had painted her out, who was, along with the French, her arch enemy at the time of her reign. They painted her as sadistic, this anti-Christian, backwards, pagan queen who was against development, who was against modernization, and was just a horrible person who killed a lot of people and did all types of brutal things to her people, and someone that should be feared, and we should know about her in that way. Doing more research, you find that some of that stuff is true, but you have to put it in the context, looking at it with African lenses. Why did she do these things? It wasn't just because she was crazy like Caligula. Caligula was just nuts. He had a horrible childhood. If you know anything about Roman history, he had a horrible childhood. He witnessed some horrible things. He was off balance, and he was one of the most powerful men in the world. So when you combine those things, it's a recipe for nuts. But not the case with Rana Valona I. So who was she? She was born in 1790, right around the time that the Merina Kingdom was being established by its first ruler. She marries her cousin, Radama I, who took over after the king. When Radama becomes king, he has a lot of pro-European policies, because the Europeans were all around Madagascar, the British, the French, and even the Dutch to some extent. And it had been so for years. The Portuguese had been there when they circumnavigated Africa, and others, because of its strategic location. Madagascar is extremely important to Indian Ocean trade. Let me see if I can find the best map to explain that. Yeah, here. So if you're the British, who are in the process of colonizing India, and you got Dutch holdings and French holdings here, French are trying to make their way to Indochina and colonize, what's now Vietnam and all this. So you have so much activity in this region. Madagascar is a perfect way station. So the coast of Madagascar, the ports of Madagascar, were incredibly important to maritime trade in the Indian Ocean that was being dominated by Europeans at the time. So very strategic place. So as this kingdom arose, it got the attention of the Europeans that had been operating on the coast. A lot of enslaved people actually came from Madagascar too. It's another area that's not studied enough in terms of the people that actually came to the Americas and other places in Madagascar. People from Madagascar were enslaved in South Africa. Many of them became part of the colored population in South Africa. In fact, in terms of the Canadian history, there's some belief that one of the first enslaved people in Canada, who was given a European name, Olivier Lejeune. He was a young man that was enslaved. He possibly was either from Madagascar or Guinea. It's still up in the air where exactly he was from. Madagascar may have been a place where this young man was from. I learned about this young man when I first came to Canada from talking to June Gervin. If you know June Gervin, she's one of the organizers of Black History Ottawa, and just a wealth of information. So she told me about this young man. I learned this story. He was actually brought to Canada. He was in one of the first classrooms in Canada. He was very bright and precocious. And one day they said they were going to baptize him. And he said, wow, baptism, is that going to make me white like you are? Because that's what he thought. He thought his skin was going to be taken off. He was going to be made white like the people that were around him. He said, well, if I get baptized, then I'll be white, and maybe I won't be treated so bad. Wasn't the case. So he was given this name, Olivier Lejeune. But as he grew up later on, he actually got into some trouble because he had talked about a Frenchman that had, this is during the time where Quebec was being fought over by the English and the French, and he had said some disparaging words about a known liar, a known Frenchman was a liar, and he said something about him, pointing that out, and then he gets locked up. So we see from the early example of Black people in Canada that Black folks get locked up for being insolent and these types of things. And he signed his name X when he was locked up, even though we know he could read and write because he was in that school. But he wasn't going to write a European name. At least my interpretation of it. He just wrote X. He just signed an X, because why would he sign a European name when obviously he's not being treated like European people? But anyway, that's a longer story for another time. But possibly he might have been from Madagascar. There was a lot of enslaved people that came from this region. So it's been very important to the story of Africa and slavery and colonialism. So this is the time that she grows up in. Like I said, her husband, Radama I, had a lot of pro-European policies. He wanted to court the French and the English to help him develop his kingdom. He wanted arms. Many of these African leaders, they wanted arms. They wanted armaments. They wanted to be able to staff their militaries with the most modern weapons. He allowed the Christian missionaries to be more active in Madagascar. He wanted the technical skills of the Europeans. He wanted trade. He wanted development of coffee plantations and different things. So he really courted the Europeans, gave them, a lot of tax breaks, and allowed them to operate on the coast and have trading centers and things like that. But then he dies, and she comes to power. And it's really interesting because, unlike other places in Africa, for what we know about Malagasy history, not a lot of female rulers. But she maneuvers to become the queen. And when she becomes queen, she's visibly pregnant. So you can really see that, this is a new phenomenon. Female leadership, openly female leadership. She's not acting like a man. She's visibly pregnant. She's a woman. She's now the leader. And it's really interesting how she becomes the queen. Because when he dies, we start to see her ability to control the political situation. She had aligned herself with key members of the military. She had aligned herself with key members of the bureaucracy, and she kills many of her rivals. We saw this with Queen Nzinga. We saw this with one of the Asante Henne's daughters we talked about last week. When people rise in order to solidify their rule on the throne, they kill their rivals. So she killed Radama's, I think, mother, his daughter from another woman, and his nephew. She just three of the prominent people that she killed. She killed a couple other people, and she solidified herself as the unquestioned queen of Madagascar, queen of the Merina Kingdom. Part of what she did, and so when she becomes queen in 1828, in 1829, the French try her. The French are like, oh, it's a woman. There's a lot of political insecurity. We can take land. We can do things. She fought the French in 1829 and defeated them. Just to let them know that, hey, just because, and she writes this, and she was a prolific writer. So we have a number of her letters that she wrote to her various officials, as well as that she wrote to Europeans. And she beat the French. She said, just because I'm a woman, don't think you can try me. And I'm paraphrasing her words. And her words are much more eloquent than mine. But she defeated the French in a naval battle in 1829. That'll be her first defeat of a European power, not her last. By the time we get to 1835, she had expelled Christian missionaries and banned proselytizing. The reason why she did this, she saw herself as queen, as the representatives of the ancestors. That wasn't just a religious thing, it was also a political thing. Because like I mentioned, if she represents the ancestors on earth and all offerings have to go to the ancestors, ultimately up to her, and then she gives material benefits from the ancestors back to the people, if you have another religion that's dissuading people from those practices and those rituals associated with those offerings, that's going to cause political problems for her. So she said, no more Christian missionaries, no more proselytizing. You cannot, spread your message here anymore. So she expelled them. The last thing she did, she made it so that the European traders had to follow marina law. Before that, if they did something, they would be, reprimanded by their superiors or whatever. But she said, no. If you're on my land, if you break laws, if you abuse my people, if you do whatever, you're going to be subject to our laws. And our laws include trial by ordeal. Meaning, you will see if you're guilty or not by, forcing you to do something physical, whether it's putting you in the water. If you drown, then maybe you were guilty. If you survive, then you weren't guilty. So different trial by ordeals were done. And of course, capital punishment and even corporal punishment things. They would whip people. So she said, you're in my land, you break my laws, you're going to be under my jurisdiction. He allowed European traders to operate basically by paying little taxes. She got rid of that. She didn't allow Europeans to trade in paper money or any other thing. She wanted hard currency. And the reason why she wanted that, she did share something with her husband, the desire to have modern weapons. But what she wanted to produce those weapons in Madagascar. She wanted industrialization of Madagascar. She didn't want to keep having to get munitions from the outside. So part of that, and then when she realized that she did need to get some from the outside while trying to build up her own, she wanted hard currency. She wanted gold. She wanted silver. She didn't want just exchange or exchange. So she had new economic policies put in place that says, okay, Europeans, if you want rice, if you want cattle to supply your ships that are going into the Indian Ocean, I need gold, because then I can use that gold to buy guns from the other Europeans to stock my army. So French, if you want this, gold. That way I can go to the British and get modern weapons. Or I can get British technical people to come to build cannons and to build gun factories so that I don't have to keep coming to you for things. She was able to get one European technician to build a few cannons, but it definitely wasn't what she wanted. So she was still somewhat dependent on European munitions coming in. So these are the things that she was doing. And of course, this made her incredibly unpopular among the Europeans. And she responded to that. In 1845, she writes that she has just as much right to nail her enemy's head at the end of a pole as the Queen Victoria to send her prisoners to exile. She's answering the Europeans and saying, how can you do this? And she said, you have a female queen, and this is what she does, and so you're in my land. So this is what I get to do. And it's really interesting that she chose Queen Victoria, because at this same time, as much as the British, and the British wrote about Rana Bologna in their newspapers as this mad queen. Even back then, they were talking about how mad this queen was. Oh, she expelled the missionaries and she's against God and blah, 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 blah. Well, at the same time, the Queen of England is committing genocide in Tasmania. But nobody's talking about this. I mean, at least the British aren't talking about it as a genocide or as a crime against humanity. They're just talking about it as this is what happens when the civilized meet the uncivilized. If the uncivilized can't conform, then they're just destined to be eliminated. And this is the beginnings of social Darwinism is about to emerge, the survival of the fittest. So if these people aren't fit to survive when they come in contact with the civilized, then whatever happens, let it happen. So they had no problem with what was going on in Tasmania. Tasmania is an island off the coast of Australia. There are no full-blooded Tasmanian people left on Earth, none. And there hasn't been since the late 19th century. There have been none. They wiped them all out. Could you imagine being the last person of your nation, the very last, and know that you're the very last person of your nation? Not to mention all the other stuff that he does in Tasmania and Australia. The British, and when she says that Queen Victoria to send her prisoners to exile, this is where they sent folks. The British turned Australia and Tasmania into penal colonies. So if you were a rapist in England, a thief, a murderer, instead of locking you up in England, they sent you to Tasmania. So what do you think they're going to do when they get to Tasmania? They're going to rape and murder and steal and do all these things. So this is one of the worst genocides of the 19th century that a lot of people don't know of. And these are Black people. I mean, look at it. I mean, even, and we're not talking about this now, but if we go into later on in Australian history, they recognize themselves as Black. They align themselves with the Garvey movement, the Aboriginal folks in Australia and New Zealand. They align themselves with Garvey. They aligned themselves with the Black Panther movement in the 1960s. So they have this Black consciousness. So these are Black people. And not only did they kill all the people and rape people and steal the land, but then they also took the bodies and put them on display in European universities to prove Darwinist theories of and eugenics and all of these things. So you see these heads displayed. But so this is fine. And you see how ugly Queen Victoria is. Look, inside and out. There's no problem with this, but because you have this African queen that is defending her religion, defending her national sovereignty, trying to develop a nation, she is the mad queen. So 1845, the British and the French are fed up with with Rana Bologna the first. What she had done, she basically tells the European traders on the coast that they have to leave. They're causing too much problems. They have to leave. And she says, you have to leave now. And they said, well, can we have like a year to get our stuff? She's like, no, you have to leave now. And many of them retreated back to their boats. And when they did, a lot of her people came into their businesses and ransacked them and burned them down. And they're on these boats and they want revenge because they're not used to being treated like this by Africans. And the British and the French, who are normally rivals, decide that we're going to pull our forces together and we're going to attack this port, Tamatave in Madagascar. These combined navies went to attack this fortification. And because of the cannons that her husband and she had placed here, and because of the bureaucracy that she had set up, they were able to defeat a combined British and French naval force. At the time when the British Navy is the strongest navy in the world, they're able to defeat this navy in 1845. One of the most important African victories. Very important. Doesn't get a lot of attention. So remember that, the Battle of Tamatave, her forces defeated the French and the British. But they weren't done. So they lose, but they say, okay, we can't beat her from the outside. Maybe we can beat her from the inside. So like I said, when she came to the throne, she was pregnant in 1828. By the time we get to the 1840s, her son is growing. And her son has been influenced by, she does let a few European officials still stay in the kingdom. Ones that she feels like she can trust or that she can work with, at least commercially, because she did have some commercial relations with Europeans. And she loved French fashion. So for much as all this stuff that she talked about, supporting her ancestors and all that, she loved French fashion. And which is not surprising. A lot of us like European things if we don't like European colonialism. I like French toast. I don't like French imperialism. So she liked French fashion. So she kept those people around. She said, if you're going to get me the dresses and latest fashion, yeah, you can stay, but don't be preaching that stuff. So there were a couple of Europeans around. And some of them that were still around tried to convince her. Well, they didn't. They succeeded in convincing her son to try to help overthrow her. And they said, look, your mother, she's gone too far. We need your help. We need you to get some officials together. We need to overthrow this woman. We'll make you king. And then we can do things the way your father wanted to do things, before he died. He was really a friend of ours. Help us out. So he went along with it. But she got wind of it. She killed a number of the officials that were involved. She exiled the French that were, putting the battery in her son's back. And she imprisoned her son for a little bit, but she didn't kill him. She didn't exile him. She didn't kill him. She just taught him a lesson, like don't try me. But she didn't kill him or anything like that. Ultimately, though, she passes away. She just dies a regular death. She's not poisoned. She's not murdered. And then her son takes over, and he actually does do the things that his father wanted to do, and we start to see more European policies. After him, there's another Rana Bologna that takes over, Rana Bologna III. And then it becomes basically at first a protectorate and then a colony, not without resistance, because as the ruling class became more pro-European, the everyday people continued to resist. And there were a lot of wars fought, a lot of battles fought in Madagascar, but ultimately became a French colony. So we'll stop there for a second and we'll open it up to any questions. But it's really important that you study her. There's a couple of readings on our course website. One is by a guy named, a scholar named Berg, who writes about her and her ancestral charisma. And that article is really good because he uses her letters to the British and the French and to her own bureaucrats to outline her political thinking. That article is really good because you can see the words that she actually uses, and she's quite eloquent And she's really good at telling people, don't try me just because I'm a woman. Don't think that, you can't be touched. I have eyes all over this island. So don't think just because you're not in my presence that I don't know what you're thinking, is what she told one of the officials. So she wasn't a woman to be trifled with. So know about her, and her contributions to this resistance. And again, 2 battles against European superpowers, and she did not lose. Battled the French and the British, and the French and British at the same time. So important defender of African sovereignty. All right, let's stop there for a second. I'll take any questions, and then we'll talk about our next figure. So Daniel, anything in the chat or any hands up?
I don't see any questions in the chat, and I don't see any hands right now.
Okay, Robin, go ahead. We got Robin in the studio, and again, everybody,
Yes.
studio's open, so please feel free to join us.
Just 2 questions. You mentioned that the part of the record is Black newspapers. I'm wondering if you have any specific names of Black newspapers, and then are there any other examples of the British and the French teaming up?
Yeah, that happens sometimes. When it permitted, when it helped both of them, whether against another European power or another African power. Oftentimes it wasn't as explicit as in this case. Oftentimes it's more behind the scenes, like we just won't interfere, or we'll give you backdoor support. But this was very explicit. This was rare. This type of team up. The Black newspapers are more so for the second half of class. This didn't get a lot of attention in Black newspapers. And at the time, this is 1830, 1840s. You didn't have any in the States yet. I have to double check when Russworm started the first Black newspaper. It might have been in the 1840s, 1850s. I know it was done by Samuel Russworm and another brother, but I can't remember. Freedom's Journal. It's called Freedom's Journal, but I don't know what year Freedom Journal started. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind looking that up for me, to let me know what year that started. But it's also important when we look at this to see how active the French were, because we started this class talking about Algeria, and while Algeria is being colonized in the 1830s, remember we talked about that. The French were they used the pretext of piracy, to invade Algeria in 1830. So we're already seeing the global dimensions of this African struggle. At the same time they're invading Algeria, they're trying to play these things and play these games in Madagascar. They're also trying to make their way into Senegal. So this is the beginnings of colonialism, the very beginnings. And Madagascar was able to defend itself all the way until the scramble actually really begins in the 1880s. Daniel, I see something in the chat.
Somebody's asking, why did you feel her value system was not carried forward by her son when the opportunity arose, especially if her people were so fond of
it? He had 2 parents. So he had a father and he had a mother. So it could have been, hearing about his father's legacy being influenced by the Europeans. There's a lot of examples of this. I mean, going all the way back to what we talked about with the Kingdom of Congo, all the way in the early 1500s with Afonso, who didn't carry on it's the same story with King Nzinga of Congo. Got baptized, figured out that the Christians wanted him to only have one wife, reversed the decision, decided to maintain his ancestral religion. But his son had been thoroughly indoctrinated by the missionaries. So when he becomes king, through the help of the Portuguese, he goes back on what his father did and starts the process of Christianizing the Kingdom of Congo, or at least the ruling class. We get the same thing here. So you have these examples of the children not wanting to follow what the parents did, and being influenced by the Europeans, by the missionaries, by European commercial activity, and having these allies that will help them get the throne, because that becomes more important than upholding what the parents did or anything like that. It's all about that power. And again, even with her, it was about power. She just got her power in a different way. She relied on internal understandings of spirituality, internal to the nation, understandings of politics and power, and that's what she formed her power base. Her son formed his power base through his collaboration with Europeans. So again, power games, power games. Anything else in the chat?
It looks like that's it for right now. Oh wait, no. Somebody asked, were there any revolts when the Sun took over?
I have to double check that if there were any revolts specifically against him. The later on revolts were against the French colonialism, but I'll double check to see if there was any exactly against him. But there might not have been, and the reason is because of the way that spiritual system worked in Madagascar, at least according to Berg. So an article by Berg, he talks about this ideology called Hasina. Hasina was that reciprocal relationship between the ancestors and the people. And one of the things that ideology presented was whoever has power has the blessing of the ancestors, no matter how they got to power. So if you're in a position of power, that means the ancestors have said you deserve to be in power for this time. So when he becomes king, many people probably thought, well, this must be the will of the ancestors, at least according to the old ideology. Now, when he becomes king, you get more of Christian influence as well. So there might have been in some, contention around that, but that's generally the pattern, at least according to one scholar named Berg. So somebody, Daniel, if you can, look up what year Freedom's Journal started.
I got it.
Oh, you got it? Okay,
yeah.
Robert.
Well, according to Wikipedia, so started in 1827 by
1820. So it was around.
Reverend John Wilk and other free black men in New York City.
So it was started in 1827. Okay, so it would have been around, but they might not have been dealing with international stuff. I'll double check that though. But really, the black newspapers pick up on the next story that we're going to talk about. It becomes the most important event in the African world during this period of colonialism. So we're going to move further east to the Kingdom of Ethiopia, the Empire of Ethiopia. So we're going like northeast, I guess was the best way to look at it directionally. So we talked about the idea of Ethiopia earlier when we talked about Sudan. Sudan used to be called Ethiopia. Now we're talking about the modern nation state of Ethiopia. This figure that we're going to talk about is Eteje or Empress Taitu Betu. Empress Taitu was, just like Rana Valona, a fierce defender of her nation. And one of the most important figures in African world history, because the victory over the Italians in 1896 that we're going to talk about, this is what spread throughout the entire world. This is what put Ethiopia on the map for African people, because it had biblical connotations and all types of things going on. So we're going to talk about her. Just like the kingdom of Marina, Ethiopia was a kingdom and an empire. And by the time that she becomes empress, it's expanding to its current, around its current territorial borders. And again, this is not voluntary association. The nations, the peoples that come underneath the empire of Ethiopia do not do so voluntarily. And this is going to have repercussions 100 years later, or 90 years later, when we talk about the Ethiopian Revolution. And this still has repercussions for today in 2022, when we see some of the regionalism and different things going on in Ethiopia now. This is the beginnings of all of this. So the Empire of Ethiopia reaches its current dimensions during her reign, or just about its current dimensions during her reign. But the expansion had started maybe 2 rulers before her and her husband Menelik II took over. So you can see this expansion in this map here. So what you see in the light tan are the current boundaries of Ethiopia. At the time of her taking the reins, this is where it was with the colored space, and it's going to expand into all of these regions. Military expansion, violent expansion, a lot of battles fought, a lot of deaths. Depending on who you talk to, a lot of crimes against humanity, all underneath this empress and her husband, the emperor. But it comes after a very interesting period. in Ethiopian history, the Zamana Mesafin, or the era of the princes. Between 1769 and 1855, there was no true empire of Ethiopia. You had an emperor, but the emperor was emperor in name only. The regions were incredibly powerful. So Tigray, which is been in the news for the past couple of years, was its own region, very powerful. Shoa was very powerful. You had Gundar. You had all of these different sub regions who paid lip service to the fact that there was a king of kings, but didn't really have power. The regional leaders, the Rosses had power. The princes had power. So it was a decentralized situation until this guy comes around, Tedros II. We don't have time to get into his life story, but he's a very interesting political figure, very controversial figure in Ethiopian history. Some people consider him the father of modern Ethiopia. Some people consider him a maniacal, expansionist who, was committing crimes against humanity and rapes and all types of other things. So very, again, mixed history when we talk about these rulers. The closer we are in time to these rulers, the more mixed it is. When you get further away in history, the more we just look at these kings and emperors as just people that expanded empires. We talk about Sundiata Keita, or we talk about Sunni Ali Burr, or Askia Muhammad Ture, or even Shaka Zulu. We rave about these people. Oh yeah, these great empire builders. But if you still have the historical record, you can still see what people said about them during the time. It becomes a little mixed. But anyway, he started this in motion, and this becomes incredibly important to Empress Taitu's story. His idea is he wants to reunite Ethiopia. He wants to end the era of the princes. He wants a strong central government. He needs a couple of things to do that. He reorganizes his military to be based on merit and not on birth. He wants to modernize the army by doing the same thing that Rana Valona did in Madagascar. He wants to produce his own weapons. He doesn't want to be reliant on European weapons. And since the 1600s, Ethiopians had a connection with European powers, particularly in terms of weaponry. In the 1600s, Ethiopia was almost taken over, this close to be taken over by Somalis, underneath a general named Ahmed Grand, Ahmed the left-handed. And had it not been for the Portuguese coming to the aid of the Ethiopians, because they were both Christian nations. So the Somalis were Muslim, and they were, allied with the Ottoman Turks, and they were about to take over Christian Ethiopia. But the Portuguese happened to be in the region. The Portuguese assisted the Ethiopians and allowed them to keep their freedom from the Somalis. And since then, Ethiopia and the European powers have pretty decent relationships, and Ethiopia was getting firearms from them occasionally, not a lot, but getting firearms and expanding their empire. So Tedros wanted weapons, but just like Radama, just like Rana Valona, he wanted to produce his own. So he kidnaps. There's a bunch of different types of missionaries in Ethiopia, even though Ethiopia is a Christian nation. It's been a Christian nation longer than most European nations have been Christian nations. But there were still missionaries. There were Protestant missionaries and Catholic missionaries in Ethiopia. He kidnapped some British missionaries. And he's like, look, I've asked the British government to send me technical advisors so that I could build guns, and they haven't. So until they do, you all are going to stay here as hostages until I get some technical advisors so I can build guns. Or the British got up, found out about this. The press was like, we can't let this happen. We have these hostages in Ethiopia. We have to go get them, blah, blah, blah. While that was going on, he actually attempted to build his own massive cannon out of this tree. And it looked impressive, but when he tried to fire it, it kind of backfired and it almost exploded. It wasn't technically sound. It was huge. This huge big cannon they tried to build. So he was trying. This is what the Japanese did too to make themselves strong. They took European weapons, disassembled them, and tried to figure out how do we build these ourselves. So he was on the same path, just like they were in Madagascar. The Ashanti did this as well in Ghana. They were trying to figure out how to do this. So this was his mistake, though. When the British found out that he did this, they sent a force into Ethiopia. And because he had set his reign up as the King of Kings by conquering all these different regions, there was no love lost for him among some of the regional leaders. So in the north, in Tigray, when the British came, the rulers in Tigray weren't happy with him. They basically just stepped aside and let the British just come straight in. And it was like, we don't really care about him. He took over by force, and he's been fighting wars to suppress rebellions during his entire reign, and we don't like what he's doing. So go ahead. So the British go in relatively easily and surround him, and he ends up taking his own life. It's a very famous image in Ethiopian iconography of him taking his own life. He's like, I'm not going to be captured by the British. Very easy victory for the British. So easy that the British they're not even interested in colonizing Ethiopia at this time. They're just like, we just want our hostages back. Mission accomplished. And they leave.
Is he shooting himself?
He shot himself. He shot himself. And after he killed himself, actually, the British came, they chopped off his hair. You see it, luscious hair. They chopped off his hair, and his hair was in the British Museum up until about 3 years ago and just got returned to Ethiopia. They took his son, Alamayu, to England, and he lived there, and he died in England. People say like a broken heart type thing. He died as a relatively young man. But yeah, they took his son, they took his hair, and they left. They got their hostages and they left. They said, we're done. Because they had bigger things to do in Africa. They were trying to conquer Egypt because they wanted access to, the Red Sea and the Nile River and that incredibly strategic area. They were also trying to take over Sudan at the time. So Ethiopia was an afterthought. But they did have a junior partner in Europe at the time who was also operating in Ethiopia, starting to, and particularly around what's now Eritrea, the Italians. And this becomes incredibly important. So the ease of this British victory convinced the Italians that if we ever wanted to conquer Ethiopia, we'll probably be able to do so relatively easily. We see how the British, with just a small force, were able to just come in. They took advantage of Ethiopian disunity, were able to come in and do what they needed to do, and could have conquered if they wanted to. So very important. A couple of years later, so this is 1868. Fast forward to 1884, the Berlin Conference. This is a big meeting of all the European tribes, the French tribe, the German tribe, the Belgians, the Portuguese tribe, all the European nations are here. And they don't want to fight each other over Africa, but they realize as the 19th century is coming to the close that they all want a piece of Africa for a number of reasons. Here's the reasons why, or reasons for colonialism in Africa. So slavery had ended. Slavery is 1885 is the last year for slavery. It's the year that Brazil ended enslavement. So slavery is over. These European powers, particularly France and England, had made their fortunes in the Americas exploiting African labor. That money was reinvested into the industrialization of Europe. So now Europe's industrializing. So if you're industrializing, you need a couple of things. You need raw materials for your industrial goods. You need iron ore, you need copper, you need palm oil, you need ivory. You need all of these things to keep your finished products coming out of those factories. You need the labor to get those raw materials. And then you need markets to sell those raw materials in, protected markets. So the French aren't going to let the British sell their goods in the places that they control, and the British aren't going to let the French sell their goods in the place because they're protecting their citizens. So you need raw materials, you need the labor to extract those raw materials, and you need markets. Colonialism met all three of those needs. If you conquer large parts of Africa, a place like Nigeria, you can get palm oil, you can get ivory, you can get tin. There's a lot of tin in Nigeria. A lot of things are in Nigeria that you can exploit, that you can use. And palm oil was incredibly important to make soap, to do other things. And then Nigeria has a huge population. So people would be forced to buy British goods that came out of those factories. The surplus things that the British didn't want, or the cheap things that the British, they would sell bicycles and things in Nigeria. You have a huge population that you can exploit and tax. So these were the reasons for colonization of Africa: raw materials, labor, markets. They didn't want to fight each other. They had just got done with the Napoleonic Wars not long ago. This is the peace of Europe. This is when the European tribes are at peace with each other. This is all going to blow up in 1914, largely because of what happened at this conference, largely because of Germany feeling like it should have more colonies. If you really want to read about this, there's a book called The World in Africa. The World in Africa by W.E.B. Du Bois. And he basically makes the argument that both World War I and World War II were the result of Europe really fighting over Africa, because Germany had become the most advanced economy in Europe, but didn't have a lot of colonies because of what happened at the Berlin Conference. So the Berlin Conference, the European tribes get together and they say, all right, let's set out the rules of how we're going to divide up Africa. No Africans were at this conference, by the way. It's just the Europeans decide among themselves. They say, all right, we need a couple of things. In order for you to say that you have a colony in Africa, we need some paperwork, we need you to have a treaty with some African ruler, and you need to have effective occupation. Meaning, if you say you control the place, you have to show that you control the place. You're collecting taxes, you have military presence, because we don't want your problems spilling into our colonies. So, Belgium, Britain, you say you control Ghana, we want to see the treaties. We want to see that you have subdued the king. We talked about this last week. You subdued Prempeh and you kidnapped him, and the people are paying you taxes, and you have control, because we don't want Ghana's problems spilling over into Cote d'Ivoire. But the French controls. The French have these treaties. They've turned, it goes from, the territories go from being a protectorate to being a colony. There's a treaty in place, effective occupation. That's what was needed. The Italians at the treaty, at the Berlin Conference, they say, well, we control Ethiopia. They say, the British and everybody else say, well, how do you control Ethiopia? They say, because we have a treaty. We're going to get a treaty, and we're going to bring it back, and we're going to show you all that we can control Ethiopia, because the British already told us it's an easy place to control. So all these things were being discussed at the Berlin Conference and being worked out between November 1884 and February 1885. It was a long conference to decide these rules on how everything was going to go. So while all this is happening, there is a new emperor in Ethiopia, Menelik II. So after Tewodros killed himself, there was another emperor named Johannes, who largely became emperor because of Tewodros, because he's the one that let the British come in. So he let the British come in, Tewodros kills himself, then he becomes emperor. He leaves the scene largely because of Menelik II, who's from the central part of modern Ethiopia, the Showa part, which used to be the south before the empire expanded. And he takes over, and one of the ways he consolidates his rule over Johannes, he actually allies himself with the Italians and gets Johannes out of the picture, and he becomes the king of kings. He wants to do the same thing that Tewodros wanted to do. He wanted to modernize Ethiopia. He wanted a strong central government, and he wanted to keep expanding. So that's what he did. He kept expanding south, conquering more lands, oppressing more people, like the Oromo, like the Arsi Oromo, like the people in Harar and others, the Sidama. All these different groups, nationalities, were forcefully incorporated into the Ethiopian empire that he was building. And in addition to that, he took people from the north and established them in the south, and gave them lands of the peoples that he conquered. This is, again, going to cause problems 90 years later. He wanted to modernize Ethiopia through reforms in education, religious tolerance, infrastructural development, merit-based administration, all the things that Tewodros was trying to do, he was doing. And he was able to do it effectively because of the strength of his military. And right at his side doing this is Empress Taitu. In fact, it's Empress Taitu who actually moves the capital to Addis Ababa and creates this new city. Addis Ababa means new flower. It was her decision to move the capital to the current capital of Ethiopia, and that city grew as a result of her efforts. So all this is happening, and the Italians are there. The Italians want to do what the other European powers were doing at the time. So in 1889, they meet with Menelik II, and they want to form a treaty. Before I get to that treaty, let me talk about what she was doing at this time. While he's empire building, she's also a part of this and a political force in her own right. So she had been married before Emperor Menelik, and but got divorced and then married him. And she came from a very prominent family up north. And because of that, she had a lot of sway over the military and other officials as her husband is building. And she has a collection of letters herself. You can read her words. And she wrote to these different regions. Because while all this is happening, this expansion is happening, you still have regional leaders that at times want to buck against the centralization of the country. And they're like, well, I don't want to be in an empire, so I'm going to revolt, even if they were from the north. So she was always looking out for people that were unloyal. And she had to make sure that her soldiers were loyal to her. So she would write things like, if all of these soldiers have come to guard me, I congratulate them. But if they intend to run away, their heads are mine and their belongings will go to those who capture them. This is how she kept discipline among the troops that were under her control. She had to deal with the rebellion of one of the conquered princes, a guy named Zagaye. And I love what she says about Zagaye. And this is what she writes to one of the local governors who was supposed to be responsible for helping to quell this rebellion. She says, men of my country, it is to prevent suffering that I have come here. Because she actually would accompany her troops with these rebellions happened. She said, since the time of Gugsa, her ancestor, until today, we've had no quarrel with you. Take care that no dissension explodes between me and you. As for Zagaye, if I should hear that you permitted him to enter and govern Yeju, or even if I learn that you allowed him to drink water in Yeju from his cupped hand, we will become you and I mortal enemies. She said, I don't even want to hear about this guy coming and getting water in this region. This is how much power that she is. She wasn't one to mince words. And she even stood up to the emperor. She talked to the emperor in ways that you wouldn't be shocked, because she had no fear. And she looked at their relationship as a partnership. It wasn't like he was just telling her what to do. It was a partnership. He was the emperor, I'm the empress. So when the Italians in 1889, and Menelik liked the Italians, because again, they helped him secure the throne when he was fighting against Johannes. So he was all for the Italians, and he liked the things that they brought him, and they talked to him really nice, and they brought him trinkets. She'd be in the back at these meetings just looking like, I don't trust these people. I don't trust them at all. So in 1889, the Italians said, oh, Menelik, yeah, we like what you're doing in Ethiopia. We're partners, right? So let's sign this treaty. We'll sign it at this place called Wuchale. We'll sign this treaty, and basically, you give us some land to operate in the north, because we have trading enterprises going on, and we want to grow coffee. Because think about this, that's one thing Italy is known for. Italy is known for its coffee, all the cappuccinos, and all these things that we drink. And nobody questions. There's no coffee grown in Italy. Where were they getting this coffee from that made them the connoisseurs of coffee? Well, it's coming from Ethiopia. So they have these business interests in Ethiopia. So they say, let's sign this treaty. And Menelik is all for it. He's like, cool. Yeah, I'll give you some land, and we'll allow you to be partners, and I can use you when I want to talk to the other European powers. That's cool. She's sitting in the back while these negotiations are going on, and she's calling him stupid and weak. And she's talking to him without looking at him, which is incredibly disrespectful. She's showing her backside to him while she's talking to him and disparaging him and calling him weak and all this stuff. And he's just trying to ignore it, but she's really attacking him. And she says to him, King John, this is the English translation, that's Johannes, the previous ruler, never wanted to cede an inch of territory. He fought against the Italians and the Egyptians for this principle. He died for this. And you, after such an example, wish to sell your country? Who will want to write your history? Is what she's telling her. Who's going to remember your history for the things that you're doing? But he signs this treaty. The Italians take the treaty and they run back to Europe. And the treaty was written in Amharic, and the treaty was written in Italian. And here's what the problem was. Article 17 of the treaty. The Amharic version of the treaty said this: if the emperor wishes, the emperor can use the Italians as an intermediary between Ethiopia and the other European powers. if he wishes. Basically, from their perspective, and according to this book, this is really good. If you want to read about modern Ethiopian history, 1885, this goes 1885 to 1991, and it's a great book. It's by Aberu Zwide, A History of Modern Ethiopia. He talks about this in this book. He says, from the Ethiopian perspective, they were going to use the Italians almost like a post office. Like, yeah, we'll send you stuff and you get it to the rest of the Europeans. That's cool. We'll use you as like a courier service. The Italian version of the treaty, the one that the Italians took back to the other European powers, based off of what they talked about at Berlin, their treaty basically said the Ethiopians must use the Italians for any correspondence or any interactions with the outside world, which basically turned Ethiopia into a protectorate. This was the piece of paper that the Italians said, this is the proof that we control Ethiopia. The Ethiopians realized what the Italians were saying and how they were interpreting the treaty. And Empress Titu was like, see, stupid, this is what I told you what was going to happen. So he, obviously feels taken advantage of. So he just rips up the treaty. He says, no, we're not honoring this. The Italians use this as a pretext to go to war. But this is what would happen in these African nations. This is how colonialism starts. These protectorates turned into colonies. The Europeans would come in, just like the mob of old. Back in the day, the mob would come into a town and they would go to a shop, let's say a bakery or a butcher shop or a shoemaker, and the mob would say, hey, there's a lot of bad people in this neighborhood, a big criminal element. So you pay us some protection money, then we'll make sure nothing happens to your shop. We'll make sure your shop doesn't get burned down. Because there's a lot of, Donald Trump said, a lot of bad hombres out there, a lot of bad folks. That's a protection racket. That's exactly what a protection treaty was. The English, the French, the Italians, the Belgians would go to African leaders and say, look, there's all these different European powers. There's your African rivals. Why don't you sign this protection treaty that says, we protect you and, we'll make sure that nobody conquers you. But essentially you're being conquered by them. So many African leaders saw behind this okie doke, some didn't, and that would lead to colonization. They ripped up the treaty. And this is the pretext for this war that's about to happen. Empress Titu said, I'm a woman and I do not love war, but sooner than accept this treaty, I prefer war. This is what she said. I prefer war. So she was ready to get down and she had her own troops. The Italians were overconfident. Remember, they're still going off the example of the British and their interactions with Tedros, that Ethiopians, they don't have unity. It'll be easy just to go in there, defeat them, we'll take over the capital, we'll run the emperor out, or we'll make him sign another treaty, and then we will have this colony, this massive colony in the Horn of Africa. We already have Eritrea. We're working on getting Somalia. Now we're going to get Ethiopia. Well, they start fighting. And the difference between 1868 and 1896 is that Menelik somehow was able to form, for a moment, a functional unity in Ethiopia. He was able to convince the other regional leaders, the key regional leaders, that, hey, I'm bad, I'm this emperor, but we don't know what the Italians are going to do. At least you know me. Let's organize around that. And they did. All the different regions sent troops. It was a different situation than what the Italians, what the British had faced in 1868. And Empress Titu was incredibly instrumental in this. Like I said, she had a tight discipline over the generals and people under her. She was at the battlefield. And the Italians, the decisive battle happened in February and March 1896. Started on February 29th, 1896. The Italians had 3 columns. They had been suffering battle losses for a while because they had tried to fight in the south and the Ethiopians routed them. And this was the last stand of the Italians, the Battle of Ottawa. They had 3 columns of troops. But the problem was they weren't coordinating with each other. And they had bad maps. And the Ethiopians were able to use counterintelligence strategies, where the Italians thought that they were getting information from people that were loyal to them, but who were in fact loyal to the emperor. So they had all types of misinformation. Their 3 columns weren't coordinated. So one column got separated from the other 2 and completely destroyed by the Ethiopians. The other 2 trying to come back to save this column, instead of turning right, they turned left because they had bad maps and ran right into some more Ethiopians who destroyed them. And then that last column also got basically taken out as well. A lot of troops were captured by the Ethiopians. A lot of people were killed, and the Italians were forced to retreat. And then sign a treaty saying that they would never try to violate the territorial integrity of Ethiopia again. This is the most important battle in African history in the 19th century during this time of colonialism, because it's the only one that kept an African kingdom free from colonization. The Ashanti put up a great fight against the British, like we talked about, but ultimately lost. The Zulu put up a great fight against the British, but ultimately lost. They're the only folks that actually won. And this is why when we look back at African history and we say the only country that was never colonized was the Kingdom of Ethiopia is correct, because everywhere else was colonized. And some people try to throw Liberia into that and say, oh, Liberia was independent too. Liberia is a settler colony of the United States. We'll get into that another time. It's a settler colony of the US. This is very much controlled by outside forces. So it's just Ethiopia. The problem with this is, well, not really a problem. That aspect of it is true. But when you talk, and which gave a sense of pride for Africans all over the world. I'll start with the pride part first. So when this happened, you got Black people all over the world cheering. Just like last week, Black people all over the world went out to go see Black Panther 2. And then when the first Black Panther came out, Black people all over the world went to say, this was real. This was a real African kingdom that defeated a real European power in a real battle. And it was Ethiopia. It was that Bible verse, Psalm 68, princes shall come out of Egypt and Ethiopia shall stretch forth their hands unto the Lord. That was read in Black churches weekend after weekend after weekend, whether it was South Africa, whether it was Zambia, whether it was Haiti, whether it was the US, whether it was Jamaica. Everybody knew that, because this is 1896. This is one of the low points in African world history. This is the beginnings of Jim Crow racism in the US and in Canada. This is during the time of colonization in the Caribbean. This is when the rest of Africa is being colonized, when South Africa is being controlled, when all types of atrocities are happening in the Congo. It's not a good time for Black people. And this was what Haiti was in 1804. Ethiopia became in 1896. This was the symbol of African independence with this king and this queen. The problem with that is, or let me go to this. So this is from the Cleveland Gazette. This is a Black newspaper in Cleveland. And there were a number of Black newspapers at this time. You got the Pittsburgh Courier, you have the Philadelphia Tribune, you have the Baltimore Afro-American, the Amsterdam News in New York. This is from the Cleveland Gazette, March 21st. So this is like about the parade of the African King Menelek's 100,000 soldiers at Massawa will tend to convince the Italian officer for whose benefit it was given that the conquest of Abyssinia is not an easy task. The recent disastrous battle to the Italian forces in Africa came very near if it did not quite do this. Who said an African wouldn't or couldn't fight? That he was naturally cowardly, etc., etc. King Menelik is proving himself more than a match for civilization's trained and skilled warriors with all their improved machinery of war. More power to him. And this was in the Black newspapers. In Brazil, they started a Black newspaper called O Menelik to celebrate this. Churches throughout the African world became known as Ethiopian churches. And Ethiopianism sprang up in South Africa, in Congo, in Namibia, all celebrating this victory. Inside of Ethiopia, however, that functional unity that existed to get the Italians out was short-lived. And soon after, Menelik had to go back on the warpath to extend his empire further south. And more crimes were committed against the Oromo, against the people in the Harare region, against other places. So while the rest of the world was celebrating, many of the people that in what would become the territory of modern Ethiopia have a different perception of Menelik and Empress Taitu, and then the subsequent emperors, including Haile Selassie. It's yeah, you may have saved this territory from European colonialism, but we're suffering from Amharic colonialism and the colonialism in internal imperialism, because this was an empire. You can't have an empire without imperialism. So just because it wasn't European imperialism, we talking about African empire building. And a lot of things came along with that come close to crimes against humanity and other things. This is all going to explode in the 1970s with the Ethiopian Revolution, where the working class in Ethiopia, some of these national groups decide that they don't want to be a part of the empire anymore, and it explodes. And it's still unresolved really today. The whole national question. How do we have these people that were forcefully incorporated into this empire operate in this modern nation state? And every now and again, you get functional unity, and then every now and again, you get people that want to break away for various reasons. And it might not be the people themselves. It could be their leaders that take advantage of local identities and things like that, and it causes issues. We saw that with the Tigray region. Before that, the Oromo were up in arms, even though the president, the prime minister, is Oromo. The people felt like particularly around the capital region, the capital was expanding, taking over people's land. So you got these things going on, these tensions. So it's an ongoing process, but this is where it started. So again, just like with Rana Belova, Empress Taitu, Shiro in some regards, complicated in other regards, but that's history. That's what it is. And to tell history right, you have to recognize both of those things. Nobody is completely a saint, and nobody is completely a sinner. There is ambiguity, and that's the great part of history. You can study, but it's really important for us to recognize both sides. So we'll stop there today. We're going to talk more about resistance to colonization next week. We'll talk about Zimbabwe, and we will talk about Rwanda. So that's session 7. So we'll stop there today. Open it up to any questions, comments, or announcements. Daniel, anything in the chat or any hands up?
I don't see anything in the chat, but Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Good afternoon, all. As I attend these lectures, I'm beginning to wonder more and more. Was there a method to silence women in those days, considering the power of the Queen's mother carries a substantial influence in England to today?
Yeah, a lot of the, in particular, so I'll talk about in terms of Africa, a lot of the missions brought a European patriarchy to parts of Africa that didn't really have it, and they attempted to place women into the homes, into the private sphere, and not in the public sphere. And part of this process of colonization was to destroy African political structures and spiritual structures, which had oftentimes upheld the power of women. So that was part and parcel of the project. And yeah, you're right. It is quite hypocritical, because if you look at what England was at the time, particularly the long reign of Queen Victoria, you had a female monarch. So by telling Africans that it was somehow backwards, that their political structures were backwards, it was all part and parcel of the colonial project. So yeah, that's a very interesting. And then the sad part is we bought into it. And many of our leaders who were trained by the French and the British in their universities and their schools with these patriarchal ideas, when independence is granted, we somehow forget our own history. And even today, we have 55 countries in Africa. Only since independence has only been probably less than 6 heads of state that have been women. So that's, a travesty. So we got to get back to our structures and the way that we understood who can wield power. That's very key.
I'll follow that up by asking that most of the English colonists, as I understand with my limited knowledge, women were made to be subservient.
Yeah.
And it's seen as subservient even today.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that has to do with the missions and the schools that the missions set up. This was the foundation of education in many of these places, and they had these patriarchal ideas. So even if it wasn't even reflected in British politics itself, the missions wanted to create this notion that man's place is public and in control of the economics of politics, and women's place is in the house. So you have that continue in zeal by our early independence leaders, and people today still hold on to some of those ideas. Pradeep, go ahead. See your hand.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have been a little bit, I have to say, unevenly attending because my family, we are trying to move to Markham soon in the next coming year. So
Okay.
a lot of planning going on for that. I try to attend when I can, obviously. Number one, a little bit aside, because you know me, I am interested in other things as well, which relate to politics and all that. So I'm really, really glad to see Hakeem Jeffries might be the new minority leader in the Democratic caucus. And actually, my feeling was that if Hillary Clinton had chosen him as her running mate, she would have had a much better chance of being elected at that time. Because he's a very dynamic leader, and to quote the notorious BIG in the House of on the Senate floor is, I was completely kind of totally impressed by that. So that's one observation. But this particular quote by which you not a quote but an observation by Du Bois that you mentioned about the world wars being about African colonization, I found very interesting because I'm very interested in military history as well, and most of the time you see that the Second World War, for example, was fought over the conquest of the East, right? Like the Russian Lebensraum by the German people, they wanted to get the land, and I never thought about. Obviously there was an element of colonies in other places as well, because India was a colony at that time as well. But I think it's probably portrayed more as European conquest than conquest of other parts of the world. So I thought I'd share that and kind of give my impression about that. So it's a very interesting quote, and actually I'm starting to read The Souls of Black Folk by W.E. Du Bois as well. So hopefully I'll get some more insight in his work.
Yeah, I mean that book, The World in Africa, is one of the books of Du Bois that folks don't really talk about as much, but is incredibly insightful. But yeah, that's the point he makes. He says, Germany got colonies. So Germany got Togo, Germany got Tanganyika, and Germany got Namibia. And in fact, it's in Namibia that Germany committed some of its first atrocities that would be, duplicated with the Holocaust like 30 years later. But they started it in Namibia in the early 20th century, concentration camps and all of that. But the problem was these colonies weren't the best, and they were kind of late to the colonial party. So when World War I comes around, this is one of the things that Germany is fighting against. And at the end of World War I, when Germany lost, the other powers take their colonies and turn them into UN protectorates. And basically they were run by the English and the French and the others. So when Hitler rises to power, that's one of the things that he wants to reverse. And Hitler makes the calculus that if I take over France, then I get all of France's colonies in Africa and in the Caribbean. They become part of Germany. And if I can conquer England, then I get all of England's colonies and we become even stronger. So that was also part of the thing. And then when we look at the Italian side of World War II, they invade Ethiopia. So we normally say that World War II begins with Germany's invasion of Poland. But really, when we talk about the global aspects of it, is really earlier with Ethiopia's invasion of, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. But because of racism, the European powers didn't care that Italy invaded Ethiopia. They didn't care at all. They only cared when Germany invaded Poland. That's when things start to to escalate in Europe. So, yeah, it's a really The World in Africa by W.E.B. Du Bois is a great text to read to look at all these dynamics.
And one of the biggest battles of World War, most important, I would say, was at El Alamein. The Rommel was defeated by Montgomery. But a lot of the troops were actually from the colonies. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other aspect of both of these wars. Africans saw them as opportunities to, some of them were conscripted. We'll talk about conscription in a couple of weeks. We talk about Kenya. But the Africans that volunteered thought that if we fight in these European tribal wars, we'll get some respect and get some rights back home. That wasn't the case. And then the same thing with the second one. But they saw the second one as really an opportunity to get free. It's when we see the independence movements emerge as well. Daniel, anything in the chat?
Yes, somebody asked if you could repeat the title of the book on Ethiopian history.
Oh yeah, it's called A History of Modern Ethiopia, 1855 to 1991. It's by Baru Zwedi. This came out, I think there might be a newer edition of this actually. This is the second edition that came out in 2001, but there might be a newer edition to this. But it's a great text. A lot of images in the text. It's written in not scholarly, so it's a lot of it's written well, so it's really accessible. Another good one, if you want to talk about the wars of colonial conquest and see the patterns involved with it, is Wars of Imperial Conquest in Africa by Bruce van der Voort. I think it's looks like it's a Dutch name, but van der Voort, unless he's South African. But this book as well shows you the European strategies and the African strategies of resistance as well. It has a Battle of Ottawa right on the front. So those are two books I'd recommend for this time period. Anything else in the chat, Dave?
Nothing else in the chat, but Sean, go ahead.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's pronounced Ian, by the way.
Oh,
so that's okay. Thank you, Clyde, for just another wonderful lecture. I just want to compliment you on bringing up the business of colonization in Africa and its the sort of connections to what we're always told on this side of the world are the causes and the reasons for the First and Second World War. And you mentioned that the wonderful work by the great W.E.B. Du Bois. There's another piece that I just wanted to mention because I came across this years back when I was doing my thesis on No. 2 Construction Battalion, trying to understand why Black folk would want to fight for different countries or be forced to fight for different countries. And he wrote that essay, you're probably familiar with, The African Roots of War.
Yeah.
When very early after the First World War broke out, he basically surmised it to be sort of the end result of the Berlin Conference and the competing for colonies and things. And the brother has also mentioned the presence of all of these Indian and African troops, and there's a whole history of the First and Second World War that we never talk about on this side of the world, where African and Indian troops are basically, compelled and forced to prop up some of the empires, and also leads to some of the interesting independence movements. So I just wanted to compliment you again on another fantastic lecture and say that it's wonderful either to be with everybody online or sometimes in the room. And this is just so great and learning from everybody. Oh, sorry, the other thing, the bigger Du Bois book that you mentioned, it can be found in libraries. It can also be downloaded. There's a couple of different sites that you can download a PDF version for if people wish.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is digitized. And in fact, I think on one of our course websites, I can't remember which course it is. I don't know if it's Early History of the African Renaissance. Or, I think The World in Africa is on one of our course sites. I just can't remember which one it is. And I know it's something else I was supposed to look up for you all. Oh, yes. While Robin, you wanted to say something. While Robin is talking, I'm going to look something up. I'm not ignoring Robin, but Robin, go ahead. I know you wanted to say something.
Yes, just a few comments and then some announcements. Yeah, them calling Rena Valona, calling her the Mad Queen. That's certainly not new, eh? We see that persisting to this day, where basically folks who are doing stuff they don't like, they label them as like leaders. That doesn't it's crazy, right? Like we saw this with they're doing it now with Putin, right? He's insane. He's insane, right? Like Gaddafi, he's insane. Right? Saddam, he's insane. Although at other times they support them, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
that's one point. The protection treaty thing you mentioned, well, that sounds a lot like I hadn't thought about that, but that sounds a lot like what the police do, right? What we have right now, right? The whole police budget is essentially a protection treaty.
So
right? It's exactly like that. It's like you give us $400 million, we'll keep you safe. They don't really actually keep us safe, but there's an illusion that they do, right? So, announcement. Just FYI, there's a conference this week put on by the Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub on research around Black entrepreneurs, and some really good discussion there around the data initiatives around Black entrepreneurs and stuff. So I'll share that link with you, actually, Claude, to share around. Today, a couple of things. So today there's a vigil at 3 p.m. at City Hall for Hodan Hashi, who's the young sister who was killed in Saskatoon about a week ago in a bar fight with a white woman. So there's a vigil for her today, 3 p.m. City Hall for that. Really relevant because this conference I mentioned, the Knowledge Conference, it was a 2-day conference. I could only go to one day because the other day I was at the pre-trial for Honor Charlie. So if people aren't familiar with that, Honor Charlie is the young brother who's accused of attempted murder, aggravated assault, a whole bunch of stuff because he stabbed some people, right? And that's not in question because they showed the videos at the pre-trial of him, right? So that's not in question. But he obviously has some serious mental health issues that led to this. And if you compare what happened to him with Hodan, right? The visual we're having today, you should look at that. So the white woman who was involved in this with Hodan, she got released on $5,000 bail, right? So she not clear what she stabbed, right? Honor Charlie, who also apparently stabbed somebody, did not get released on bail. So there's that, right? The other thing is that at the pre-trial, so one of the people he stabbed is an old Chinese guy, okay, who was actually at the pre-trial testifying. Okay, when you get at the beginning of there was a Mandarin translator there, so the guy comes up and she asks him, would you state your name and spell it for the record, right, in Mandarin, and he said something in Mandarin, and then the translator said, Your Honor, he said he's not comfortable saying his name because the Honor's family is here and he's afraid that they'll take retribution and revenge on him. The judge, instead of saying something like, well, sir, like the family is here because they cared about their loved ones and that, what the judge said was, he asked the 2 detectives who are in the audience to stand up. These are the 2 detectives on the case to stand up, and he said, you see these 2 detectives? They're here. Nothing's going to happen here. Essentially saying, don't worry, that yeah, you're right. These niggers could be violent, but don't worry, these police officers will make sure they aren't. So there you go. So anyway, we'll be watching the especially the trial of Honor in particularly very carefully and taking down some of the stuff that's happening. It's inconsistent. He has a really great black lawyer, Michael Smith, who's great. Right? He's fantastic. Yeah, I'll leave it there, I guess. So.
All right, thank you. Before we go to the hand that I see up, let me just, I told you I would give you the name of the founder of the Kingdom of Marina. So you might want to write this down because can't write it on the screen. But his name is Andrianam Poeni Marina. And that name is spelled AndrianaMpoeniMerina. Yes. When I say they have long names and the Malagasy name I'm not, it's a very long name. So I'll put that out on the screen next week. I just wanted to let you know I didn't forget about that. Ms. Anderson, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Robin for the update and honor. Have you known him since he was a little guy? Because he grew up in the church that I attended. And at the time when the incident happened, everybody who knew him said it was out of character. He obviously had a mental breakdown. He was scheduled to start college. Apparently got a scholarship or something, and really decent family, and everybody is shocked that this happened. So I wonder, is he still in jail then, Robin?
Yeah, he's been in custody since the incident. So he was there, right? He was there, right, at the pretrial hearing. So and his family was too, right? All his sisters are there, his mother's there. So he has a lot of support in the courtroom, which is great. But yeah, again, he's been in custody again, unlike the white woman who killed Hudan, who's walking around.
Right. Yeah, I hope that there will be some sort of psychiatrist report or something to support, his state of mind at that time. Just hope for that.
They're trying to get that, but I'm sure, and the way things are looking, they'll have no problem showing that. I mean, it's just from the facts of the case right now, it's absolutely clear that there were mental health issues going on. So I think they have a pretty, and it appears obviously that the case is not that he didn't do it; it's that he did it, but there's mental health issues, and I think that it seems they have a pretty strong case in that area. So.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you, and please keep us up to date.
Yes,
I definitely will. Yeah.
One more announcement that we'll close out today. Next week, we have another Jaku Kampi Community Build session, which is part of our mentorship program. And we're going to be joined by a local artist, Cal Kaden Asifa, who's a brilliant brother. He's done a lot of murals around the city concerning Black Lives Matter. He's going to be talking about activism and artwork and how you can make a living off your creative work. So we're having that meeting next Saturday at 2:30 at the Bronson Center in room 103. So if you know any young people that are interested or anybody else is interested in being a mentor, feel free to come out and join us. We're going to have food like we did last time. We had a good conversation last time. We're going to continue that. So come out and hear this brother talk and just join us in the fellowship. Robert,
one more thing I forgot to mention. So the hub, 613-819 Block Hub, in conjunction with Emoja, it's a group at Carlton, is we're doing a Black Panther thing where we're going to fund 50 students to go see Black Panther on December the 9th.
Okay.
Right? So again, I'll share the link with you on that one, right? So through Emoja, which is at Carlton, they're doing university students open too. We also want to get some brothers and sisters from lower income neighborhoods who want to do this. So anyways, I'll share it with you. You can share it with the folks.
Oh, and also that's that other meeting that's coming up is really important too. That you had shared with the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. Our brother Richard Sharp is there's a lot of stuff going on. Our brother Richard Sharp is going there to Geneva, and it's an opportunity to give information to him about what we think are the human rights needs of Afro-descendant people that should be brought up. So that meeting is Tuesday.
Yes, right. That is that's a hub meeting on Tuesday, 8 in the evening, 8 to 9:30. Yeah, so it's actually Richard Sharp and Andrea Pierce who are going to Geneva. Exactly. Yeah. So it's our chance to basically tell them what to tell the UN in terms of what the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. What the priorities are. And yeah,
this is key. So many things. I mean, I know I'm going to be on the call, definitely pushing to talk about particularly our brothers and sisters that are migrant workers. It's one thing that we don't talk enough about. For Canada, Canada hasn't signed the International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers, and that's really having a negative effect on brothers that are work. Every time you go to the store and you see that produce, understand that that's been picked mostly by, you see the commercials, it's, oh, it's our family farm. It's not the people on the commercials picking that stuff. It's brothers and sisters from Trinidad and Jamaica and Honduras and Mexico that are up there, and sometimes in horrible conditions, sometimes get hurt medically and aren't given the treatment that they need. Sometimes they're in slave-like conditions. So very important meeting. I think I see a hand. I think that's Ms. Jennifer. Go ahead, and I think I see something in the chat as well.
Hi, I just wanted to know how do you get the link to the meeting on Tuesday from 8 to 9:30 with Richard Sharp and Andrew Pierce?
I think Robin shared it with me. I can share it with the folks that are on. I'll send an email with it. I'll forward it.
Okay.
Daniel, what's in the chat? I can't see it.
I was just posting a link to one of the books in the chat.
Okay.
Somebody did just post another question in here. Question about the woman king with Viola Davis. Is there an apparent controversy around slavery? Does anybody know what this controversy was about?
I think the main thing is people look at the group of women that were presented. I think that's one of the things, is that historically they were involved in slaving activities, but they addressed that in the film. So a lot of the controversy is from people that either didn't see the movie or weren't paying attention, because the movie addresses the complexity of the situation, the complexity of that kingdom. And although it's historical fiction, I think it does so quite well. So it doesn't paint the people as being completely blameless. Just like we talk about the history today, you can't talk about history and look for complete good guys and bad guys, unless you're talking about Harriet Tubman. There's nothing negative you can say about Harriet Tubman. Yeah, but other than that, there's very few people like that you can have non-contradictions. We all have contradictions, and yeah. So yeah, a lot of that criticism, I think, is from people that have not paid a true attention to the movie, or only know partial history, or just want to be contrarian. Daniel, you want to say anything about that? As I know there was a big conversation about that at Temple.
I don't know if I have anything to say besides these are coming from people who I would consider armchair historians. I would consider these people who've actually invested actual time into doing research about the people in question. But other than that, I don't necessarily think I have anything else to add to that.
Definitely. Yeah, it's key to do with history. That's why I always point out evidence. That's why we start all of our conversations with, here's where you can find the evidence for the things that I'm saying, whether it's the primary sources or it's the secondary sources that we have. All right. Anything left in the chat? Is that something? Oh, that's a thank you. Okay. So we'll close there for the day, everyone. Everybody stay safe. If you're in Ottawa, I think they're calling for some snow or something later. So stay safe. And if you're anywhere else, we'll talk next week. Everybody, have a good one.